Dust Creek, 1,883. The sun is bleeding out on the horizon. 5 men, 1 woman, nowhere to run. Callahan presses his revolver to Hannah's forehead and smiles. Sign it over. Tonight. Then, clack-clack from the dark hayloft above, a stranger steps into the light. Voice low, eyes cold. Not a tremor in his hands. Step away from her. Nobody moves. 1 woman who refuses to fall. 1 broken man learning to stand again. This is their story. Keep watching. It only gets wilder from here. The sun had no mercy in Dust Creek. It pressed down on everything: the cracked earth, the weathered storefronts, the horses standing still in the heat like they'd given up on moving. By mid-morning, the air itself felt thick enough to chew. Hannah Thorne was sweating through her shirt. She had the broken wagon jacked up on a stack of flat stones, the iron lever wedged under the axle, her whole body leaning into it. The wheel had snapped spoke clean through and then seized on the hub. Heavy thing. Dead weight. She'd been wrestling it for the better part of an hour. She adjusted her grip, set her boots wider in the dirt, and pushed. The hub groaned, shifted. She pushed harder, jaw tight, breath coming in short bursts through her nose. It gave. The wheel lifted just enough. She kicked the replacement into place with her boot heel, guided the hub pin through by feel, and lowered the whole assembly back down. Then she stood there a moment with her hands on her knees, breathing. Nobody had helped her. Nobody had offered. That was fine. She hadn't asked. Thorne's stage stop in livery sat at the south end of Dust Creek's main road, just far enough from the saloon that she didn't have to hear the music at night. Her father had built it 20 years ago, with 2 hired hands and a borrowed mule team. She'd grown up sweeping its floors, feeding its horses, learning its rhythms. When he died 3 years back, he left it to her with no conditions and no apologies. Just a handshake he couldn't give anymore. She wiped her face with the back of her forearm and surveyed the yard. 6 horses in the paddock, 2 coaches waiting for axle grease, a fresh load of hay stacked near the south wall. Plenty of work. Always plenty of work. She was heading back toward the barn when she heard boots on the road. The courier was young, maybe 19, wearing the tan vest of Gideon Sterling's bank. He walked the way people do when someone important sent them fast enough to look official, nervous enough to betray it. He had an envelope in his hand, already extended toward her before he'd even reached the gate. Miss Thorne. She took it without a word, broke the wax seal, unfolded the paper. She read it twice. Foreclosure notice. Her property, listed by legal description, cited against an outstanding debt she had never agreed to, drawn up in language designed to confuse and overwhelm. Sterling's signature at the bottom, looped and self-satisfied. She folded the paper back along its crease, looked at the courier. "Tell Mr. Sterling," she said, "that this notice is illegal. My father's deed is registered and clear. There is no outstanding debt because there was no loan. And if he sends another piece of paper to my property, I'll be delivering my response directly to a federal land office." The courier blinked. He'd probably expected tears, maybe pleading. He took the envelope back and walked away faster than he'd come. Hannah stood there a moment after he turned the corner. Then she went back to work. She was rehanging a stall door that afternoon when the rider came through the gate. She heard the horse first, a steady, unhurried walk, the kind that meant the rider wasn't in a hurry and wasn't trying to sneak up on anyone either. She kept her hands on the hinge pin and looked over her shoulder. He was lean and trail-worn, the kind of lean that came from months on the road rather than any shortage of muscle. His jacket was sun-faded, and his boots were caked in Red Canyon dust. Under a battered gray Stetson, his eyes were a quiet sort of gray-blue that didn't quite match the rest of him. Sharp, watchful, taking in the whole yard in one sweep without making it obvious. He stopped the horse just inside the gate and didn't dismount. "Looking for the owner," he said. "You found her." He glanced at the stall door she was rehanging, then back at her. "I'm looking for work. Temporary. Passage money, not wages. I'm moving on after a few weeks." Hannah studied him. She'd learned over the years that men came in roughly two kinds when they showed up at her gate alone. The kind who immediately looked for someone else to talk to, someone male, someone who seemed more like what they expected an owner to be, and the kind who just talked to whoever was standing in front of them. This one had talked to her. "What's your name?" "Jesse." "Morgan? You have experience with horses?" "More than most." It's not an answer. A pause. 7 years riding circuit in open country. I've shod horses, treated colic, pulled foals, driven teams in mountain passes. I can do carpentry well enough. I don't drink on the job. She set the hinge pin and tested the door's swing. Even. Smooth. "I've got 2 weeks of heavy work," she said. "Rebuilding the south fence line, retarring the coach roof, general maintenance. I pay fair and I expect a fair day's work in return. You eat at my table, you follow my rules on this property. You disagree with an order, you say so plainly and we discuss it. You don't just do what you want." "Understood. Good." She set down her tools. "Stable your horse in the third stall. There's a bunk room off the back of the barn. Water pumps on the east wall." He nodded once. No excessive thanks. No performance of gratitude. He simply dismounted and led his horse toward the stable. Hannah watched him go for just a moment. Something about him sat odd. Not threatening, not dishonest. Just held in. Like a man carrying something he'd gotten practiced at not letting show. She recognized it because she did the same thing. By evening, the yard was cooling down, and the light had gone long and amber across the dust. Hannah sat on the fence rail, tallying the week's accounts in a small leather book. The numbers were tight. They'd been tight since Sterling started quietly pressuring local freight companies to use the North Road instead of stopping at her livery. Nothing she could prove, nothing she could fight directly. Just a slow squeeze. She closed the book. Inside the barn, she could hear Jesse working in quiet. He'd repaired 2 broken feed buckets without being asked. She noticed. Had swept out the center aisle, too. He hadn't mentioned it or pointed it out. Just did it. She went inside. He was checking the feet of her lead mare, working carefully around a stone bruise on the frog of the right front hoof. He looked up when she came in, but didn't stop what he was doing. "She's been favoring that foot?" he asked. 2 days. Stone bruise. Nothing serious. Keep her off the hard road another week, and it'll clear on its own. Hannah leaned against the stall wall and watched him work. He was good with the horse. The mare was particular about She'd kicked a man from Tulsa clean through a fence post last spring, but she stood easy under Jesse's hands. Animals were better judges than most people. Hannah had always believed that. "You from around this territory?" she asked. No, she waited to see if he'd add anything. He didn't. "I'm not asking to pry," she said. "I just make a point of knowing who's on my property." He set the mare's foot down and straightened. For a moment, he seemed to consider something. "I've been moving around," he said finally. "For a while now." He looked at her steadily. "I don't cause trouble, Miss Thorne. I just work. That's all I'm here to do." There was something final in how he said it. Not rude, just closed, like a window latched from the inside. She respected that. She had her own latched windows. "Supper. In 20 minutes?" she said. "Don't be late." She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard him return to the mare's feet, quiet and methodical in the fading light. Outside, the sky had gone deep rose and orange over the ridge. Beautiful, the way the desert evenings always were. The kind of beauty that didn't care what was happening underneath it. Somewhere across town, she knew, Gideon Sterling was sitting behind his mahogany desk in his tailored suit, already planning his next move. Hannah Thorne walked through her door, set the account book on the shelf, and started the fire for supper. She wasn't going anywhere. The sun went down like something burning. It hit the horizon line and spread red first, then deeper, the color of old rust and dried blood, and it pulled long shadows across the livery yard until everything looked like it was leaning away from it. Hannah had seen 1,000 sunsets over Dust Creek. This one felt different, felt like a warning she couldn't read yet. She was alone in the stable. Jessie had ridden into town an hour earlier to buy oakum rope for the fence repair. She'd told him to take his time. She wished now she hadn't. She was measuring feed ratios by lantern light when she heard the gate. Not a knock, not a call, just the creak of wood swinging open. The kind that meant whoever it was didn't feel they needed to announce themselves. Hannah set down her scoop and turned. 5 men walked through the door. She knew one of them by name, Jeb Callahan, Sterling's enforcer. He was broad across the shoulders and moved with the lazy confidence of a man who had never once been told no, without consequences following. He wore his gun low on his hip and his hat pushed back like he owned whatever room he walked into. The 4 behind him she'd seen around town. The big one people called Buck, all jaw and no neck, with hands like sledgehammers. Tex, who was thin and cold-eyed and always seemed to be looking past whoever he was talking to, like he was already planning the exit. Grady, dark-tempered and restless, jaw working on something, unable to stand still. And the last one, young, maybe 18. He hung back a half step from the others and kept his eyes moving around the stable instead of fixing them on her. Something about him seemed less settled than the rest. Callahan stopped in the center of the aisle, looked around the stable slowly. Then he looked at her. "Evening, Miss Thorne." She didn't answer that. "Mr. Sterling tells me you received a notice today." He folded his arms. "Says you weren't too cooperative about it." I told his courier the notice was illegal. That's accurate, not uncooperative. Callahan smiled. It didn't reach anything above his mouth. Mr. Sterling has a different view on what's legal in this town. He usually does, and his view tends to be the one that sticks. Hannah kept her voice level. "This is my property. You can leave the same way you came in." Nobody moved. Callahan walked forward. Slow, deliberate. She backed up a step, then caught herself and stopped. He kept coming until she was against the wooden stall, the gate digging into her lower back. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. Her deed copy, the one she kept framed above the office desk. Somebody had been in her office. Her stomach went cold. He held it up between 2 fingers. Then he tore it in half, then in half again. He let the pieces fall. "Property changes hands," he said. "That's just how things go." Hannah moved. She grabbed the heavy steel horsebrush off the stall hook and swung it hard at his forearm. It connected, and he pulled back, more surprised than hurt. She pushed off the stall and put distance between them. Brush raised. "Come at me again," she said, "and you'll get the pointed end." For a second, nobody moved. Then Buck laughed, a low, ugly sound, and Callahan straightened his jacket. Something in his face had changed. The performance of civility was done. "Take it from her," he said. Tex and Grady moved from opposite sides. Hannah swung once more, caught Tex across the knuckles, heard him curse, but there were 5 of them, and 1 of her, and she knew the math. Grady grabbed her wrist and wrenched. The brush hit the ground. Buck stepped in from behind and pushed her back against the stall wall, hard enough to rattle the boards. She was pinned. Callahan got close again. He wasn't smiling now. "You're going to sign over what's left of this place," he said quietly, "tonight. And then you're going to take whatever Sterling decides to give you and go be grateful somewhere else." The lantern threw orange light across everything. The horses shifted in their stalls, uneasy. The young one, Caleb, was standing at the edge of the group, and he wasn't watching her anymore. He was looking at the ground. Hannah opened her mouth. From somewhere above them, up in the dark of the hayloft, there was a sound. A dry, mechanical double click. Metallic. Unmistakable. Everybody froze. Jesse stepped out of the shadows at the loft edge. He was holding a double-barrel shotgun, leveled straight down at Callahan's head. His face was completely still. He looked like a man who had done this before and found it routine. "Step away from her." 3 words, quiet as a Sunday morning. Every one of them landing like a stone in still water. Nobody moved for a beat. Then 2. Callahan turned his head slowly and looked up. He was calculating. Hannah could see it, running the numbers, measuring Jesse's hands, looking for a tremor. There wasn't one. Jesse kept the barrels trained right between Callahan's eyes. I can't take down all 5 of you before I get hit, Callahan. His voice was flat and conversational, like he was discussing feed prices. But these 2 barrels of buckshot guarantee your head comes off first. Who wants to test their luck? Silence. Buck shifted his weight. Jesse's eyes moved to him instantly, just eyes. Not the gun, and Buck went still again. Callahan stared up at Jesse for a long moment. His jaw worked. A man like Callahan didn't back down because he was afraid. Exactly. He backed down because he was calculating survival odds, and right now the odds were extremely clear. He stepped back from Hannah. One step, then another. Let her go, he said to Grady. Grady released her wrist. Hannah straightened and put 3 feet of space between herself and all of them. She didn't reach for anything. She just stood and breathed and watched. Callahan adjusted his hat, picked up the brim like he was tipping it, like this was still a social call. You've bought yourself some time, friend, he said up to Jesse. That's all you've bought. Jesse said nothing. Callahan turned and walked toward the door. The others followed. Buck, Tex, Grady in a loose cluster. Caleb last. At the door, the boy turned and looked back at Hannah for just a second. Not threatening, not cold. Something else. Something that didn't belong in this company. Then he was gone. The gate creaked shut. Jesse held the shotgun level for another 5 seconds, watching the door. Then he lowered it and came down the loft ladder. Boots hitting the dirt floor quiet and even. Hannah looked at the torn pieces of her deed scattered on the ground. Then she looked at Jesse. How long were you up there? Long enough. You came back early. Store was closed. He set the shotgun against the wall and crouched down, gathering the torn paper. Saw them go in. Came around the back. She watched him collect the pieces. Thank you, she said. He looked up at her briefly, then back at the paper. We should lock up tonight.
Yes, she said.
We should outside. The last red light bled out of the sky and left everything dark. They didn't speak much over the next hour. Jesse checked the loft, the rear wall, the gate latch. Hannah watered the horses and closed the stable shutters. They moved around each other efficiently, like 2 people who'd learned that doing the next task was better than standing around feeling shaken. But she was shaken. She knew it and didn't bother pretending otherwise. At least, not to herself. The deed could be redrawn. She had the registered copy at the county seat. Sterling knew that. This wasn't about paperwork. It was about her nerve. He was testing whether she had it. She did. But she also wasn't naive. 5 men, and Callahan barely broke a sweat. This was just the beginning. Jesse came back through the stable door and latched it from the inside. Get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. We'll take turns, Hannah said. He looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. 2-hour shifts, she said. I'll take the first one. He accepted that with a nod and went to the bunk room. Hannah sat in the stable, in the lantern light, with the shotgun across her knees and the torn pieces of her deed folded back together in her shirt pocket. Out in the dark somewhere, Callahan was reporting back to Sterling. She stayed very still and listened to the horses breathe and waited for whatever came next. Jesse didn't sleep. He lay in the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to the night sounds of the stable, the horses shifting, the creak of old wood settling, and underneath it all, the quiet movement of Hannah making her rounds. He knew her footsteps already, measured, deliberate. She walked like someone who owned the ground she stood on. He'd been in enough bad situations to know this one wasn't over. Callahan wasn't the kind of man who accepted a retreat and called it a lesson learned. He'd go back to Sterling, get new instructions, and come back harder. The only question was timing. When Hannah's 2 hours were up, she came to the bunk room doorway. Your turn, he was already sitting up with his boots on. She blinked. Did you sleep at all? Enough. She looked at him for a moment. Didn't push it. She knew better. He did his watch, and she slept for a few hours, and then dawn came in gray and thin over the ridge. By the time the light was full, they were both up and working, and neither of them was talking about the night before. That was a kind of agreement they'd reached without words. but it ended by mid-morning. Jesse had dragged a heavy cabinet in front of the interior door, connecting the main barn to the small back storeroom, the one with a lock and no windows. He'd done it between fixing a water trough and renailing a loose fence board. Practical. Quiet. He'd said nothing about it. Hannah saw it when she came in to check the feed inventory. She stopped, looked at the cabinet, looked at Jesse, who was across the barn checking the window shutters. "What is this?" He turned. "If they come again tonight, I want you in that room. It's the only interior space with no direct line of sight from outside." Hannah walked over to the cabinet, tested it with her hand. Heavy, solid, pushed against the door, so the door couldn't swing open from the inside without real effort. "You were going to lock me in here," she said. "It's the safest. You were going to put me in a box." She said it evenly, not loud. "And stand between me and whatever comes through that door. By yourself. I cannot the point." She turned to face him. "I don't need a living shield to die in my place and leave me trapped in a glass cage. If this is my home, we stand side by side as equal partners." Jesse was quiet. She held his gaze. "I mean that, Jesse. Not as a sentiment. As a condition of you staying on this property." He looked at the cabinet. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not stubbornness. More like a habit he'd had so long he'd stopped noticing it. The habit of protecting by containing. Making the person you wanted to keep safe, smaller, still, tucked away where nothing could reach them. He'd done it before, she could tell. "All right," he said finally. "Then move the cabinet." He moved the cabinet. When it was back where it belonged, he stood there in the center of the barn and looked at her. "You know how to shoot?" he asked, poorly. It was more honesty than he expected. He nodded once. "Then let me show you." He brought out the Winchester from his saddle pack, a model 1873, worn smooth at the grip, the barrel clean and well kept. He set it on the workbench, and Hannah stood across from it and looked at it without touching it. He noticed the way her eyes went to it and then came back to him, the way her hands stayed at her sides. "You don't have to pick it up right now," he said. "I know." She reached out and picked it up. Her hands were steady for about 4 seconds. Then the tremor started. Fine at first, barely visible. Then enough that the barrel drifted off target, even though she was aiming at nothing. She set it back down and stepped back and pressed her fingers flat against her thighs. Jesse said nothing. He just waited. It took her a moment. Then she exhaled. "I was 16, she said. "My younger brother and I were playing in the barn. There was an old pistol of my father's on the shelf. I was showing it to him stupidly because I didn't know what I was doing, and it discharged." She stopped. It hit him in the shoulder. He kept the arm, but it was a long recovery. She looked at the Winchester on the bench. "I haven't fired a gun since that day." Jesse looked at her steadily. "How old is your brother now?" 22. "He's in Sacramento. He's fine. Does he blame you?" "No. He said so 100 times. But you still do." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. Jesse pulled the workbench stool around and sat down so he was at her level, rather than standing over her. He rested his forearms on his knees. "The gun didn't go off because you're careless," he said. "It went off because you didn't have the training to handle it safely. That's different. One is about who you are. The other is about what you didn't know yet. I know that. Knowing it in your head and believing it in your hands are two different things." He nodded at the Winchester. "The point of learning to shoot isn't just pulling a trigger. It's learning that you're in control of what the gun does, not the other way around." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like you've taught this before." "Once or twice." She looked at the rifle again. Long look this time. Then she reached out and picked it up again. "Show me," she said. They started with stance. He stood behind her and to the left, not touching, just directing. Feet shoulder width apart, weight forward slightly. She had good natural posture. Years of physical work had given her a solid center of gravity. He told her that and meant it. "The most important thing," he said, "before the trigger, before the sight is breathing. You shoot on the exhale. halfway out. You stop the breath there, just for a second, and that's when the gun fires. You do it right, and the gun barely moves. And if I'm panicking, then you breathe first. Everything else second. He moved around to her right side. There are people who'll tell you that under pressure your training takes over. That's true, but only if the training goes deep enough. The goal is to practice being calm until calm is what you know. That sounds like something that takes more than one afternoon. It does. This afternoon, we're just getting you comfortable holding it. He walked her through it slowly, loading the feel of the action, aiming at a knot in the far barn wall. She was tight at first, shoulders up, jaw set, breath held too long. He noticed every detail but didn't correct them all at once. He picked one thing at a time. "Drop your shoulders," he said. She did. "Now breathe out slow." She did that too. "There you go." She dry-fired at the knot. The hammer clicked. She flinched slightly, then caught herself. "Again," she said. She did it, again and again. By the 10th time, the flinch was gone. Her shoulders stayed down. Her exhale was steady. He could see the tremor in her hands diminishing, not because she was gripping harder, but because she'd stopped fighting the grip and just let the rifle settle into her hands. "You're doing it," he said. She lowered the rifle and looked at him sidelong. "Don't congratulate me yet." That was an empty gun aimed at a wall. He almost smiled. "True. When do we use live rounds?" "Tomorrow. Somewhere outside where the sound won't carry to town." She nodded. She held the Winchester in both hands and looked at it, differently than before. Not with fear exactly, with attention, with the beginning of ownership. "Jesse." She didn't look at him when she said it. "Why did you stay? After last night, you could have ridden on before sunrise. This is my problem, not yours." He considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "Not fully." She accepted that, fair enough. She handed him the Winchester, and he cleared it and set it on the bench. Outside the barn door, the afternoon light had gone thick and golden. The horses moved lazily in the paddock. The yard was quiet, deceptively, almost cruelly quiet. Both of them knew it wouldn't stay that way. But for this 1 hour, in this one barn, with the rifle on the workbench, and the day going slowly toward evening, something had shifted. Not solved. Not safe. Just shifted. Hannah went to start the evening feed. Jesse went back to the fence line, and neither of them said anything else, because for now, nothing else needed saying. The well water smelled wrong on Tuesday morning. Hannah noticed it when she went to fill the horse troughs before sunrise. She pulled the bucket up and held the lantern over it, and the surface had a dark, oily sheen, catching the light wrong. She dipped 2 fingers in and brought them to her nose. Black oil. Someone had poured it down the shaft. She stood there for a moment with the bucket in her hand and the lantern swinging gently in the pre-dawn breeze. Then she set the bucket down carefully, like it was something that deserved to be set down rather than dropped, and walked back to the barn. Jesse was already up. He was never not already up. "The well's been poisoned," she said. He looked up from the bridle he was repairing. Read her face. Set the bridle down. They went out together, and he checked it himself, pulled another bucket, crouched down, and looked at the shaft walls with the lantern lowered, stood back up. His expression was flat in the way it got when he was keeping something controlled. "Deep pour," he said. "Not just the top. They did this deliberately, and they did it right." "I know. We'll need to haul water from the creek for the horses until it's cleared. Clearing it will take days, maybe a week. We have to pull the shaft and flush it." He paused. "It's not just water, Hannah. It kills the grass around the base, too. That whole patch of paddock ground is going to be useless for a season." She already knew all of this. She was a rancher's daughter. She understood exactly what a poisoned well meant, not just for today, but for the weeks after it. The cost of hauling water, the weight of the work, the way it would slow everything else down. That was the point. Sterling wasn't trying to burn her out in one night. He was trying to grind her down. Make the property more trouble than it was worth. Make her tired enough to take whatever he offered just to make it stop. She turned and looked out over the yard. First light was coming up gray over the eastern ridge. What else, she said. Not a question, a statement. She was already expecting more. Jessie's was quiet for a beat. Then the horse herd, she turned fast. The south paddock gate was open. She hadn't noticed in the dark coming over. The gate was open and the paddock was empty. All 6 horses gone scattered into the scrubland south of the property. While she and Jessie slept, Hannah walked to the open gate and stood there, looking at the empty field. 6 horses, her breeding stock, her working animals, her income on 4 legs each, gone into rough country in the dark. 2 of them were skittish. One had a stone bruise still healing. Finding them all and bringing them back would take most of the day, maybe 2 days. And meanwhile, the coaches scheduled for Thursday would have no teams. She closed the gate latch, slowly, even though it was pointless now. I'll go out after them, Jessie said behind her. I know tracking in scrubland. We both go, she said, after we haul water for the troughs first. He didn't argue. By noon, she'd heard from 3 different townspeople that they wouldn't be needing her livery services for the foreseeable future. The first was old Carter from the freight company, who came in person and had the decency to look embarrassed. He wouldn't say who'd pressured him. He didn't have to. The second was a note slipped under the stable door. The third was a man she'd never seen before, who delivered the news from horseback, without dismounting, and rode away before she could respond. Sterling was thorough. She'd give him that. Jessie came back with 4 of the 6 horses by late afternoon, pushing them through the south gate with the practiced patience of a man who'd done this work 100 times. He'd found them spread across 2 miles of scrubland. The remaining 2 he'd tracked to the creek bed they came in on their own when they heard the others. All 6 back. The stone-bruised mare had opened the sore up again on the rough ground. Jessie cleaned and rewrapped it without comment. Hannah fed them all and checked their legs and stood in the paddock in the last of the daylight and felt the weight of the day sitting on her shoulders like something physical. She'd lost the freight contracts. She'd lost 2 days of work to the well and the horses. She had 1 stage line still routing through her stop, and she was already calculating how long she could run on that alone. She was doing the math when she heard something behind the chicken coop. She went around the corner of the coop quietly. The boy was crouched at the base of the back wall, with a lantern and a tin of kerosene. He was 18. At most, she'd noticed him among Callahan's men the night of the standoff, the one who'd looked at the floor. Up close now, he looked younger. He had a thin, patchy beard that hadn't come in right yet, and his clothes were worn through at both elbows. His hands were shaking. He heard her footstep and scrambled up, knocking the lantern sideways. It didn't spill. Don't, he started. Put the kerosene down, Hannah said. He looked at her, looked at the door, looked back at her. He was calculating the same way Callahan had in the stable, measuring odds, measuring escape routes. But this one wasn't cold. He was scared. There was a real difference. I have to, he said. Callahan said if I don't. Put it down, he put it down. His whole posture changed when he did it, like he'd been holding himself up with the intention, and without it, he just went slack. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. He was waiting to be grabbed, waiting to be hit or marched somewhere or shouted at. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he'd pulled his shoulders up around his ears. She picked up the kerosene tin and set it aside. She picked up the lantern and straightened the wick. What's your name? She said. He blinked. Caleb. Caleb, she nodded once. Come inside. He didn't move. I'm not going to hurt you, she said. And I'm not calling the sheriff because the sheriff in this town works for the same man you do. Come inside. She sat him at the kitchen table. Jessie appeared in the doorway after a minute, took one look at the situation, and stayed quiet. Hannah went to the stove. She made coffee, cut bread, found the leftover beef from dinner, and put it on a plate in front of him. He looked at the plate like he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch it. Eat, she said. He ate. He was hungry, genuinely, deeply hungry, the hunger of someone who hadn't had a real meal in days. She refilled the plate without being asked, and he ate that too. There was a cut above his eyebrow she hadn't noticed outside, old enough to be a day or two old, still bruised around the edges. She got a cloth and a bowl of clean water hauled from the creek and set it on the table. He looked at it. "It won't hurt," she said. She cleaned the cut efficiently and without fuss. He sat very still. When she was done, she put the cloth aside and sat across from him with her coffee and looked at him directly. "How long have you been with Callahan's crew?" 7 months. "How'd you end up there?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "My family's farm went under 2 winters back. I owed money not to Sterling, to a merchant in Abilene. Callahan said he'd cover the debt if I worked for him." "Did he cover it?" Caleb was quiet for a beat. "He said he would." There it was. Hannah let that sit for a moment. Let him hear what he'd just said. "He never paid it," Jesse said from the doorway. Caleb looked down at the table. "Didn't confirm it. Didn't have to." Hannah leaned forward slightly. "Poverty might make your stomach empty, Caleb. But choosing to be cruel is a blindness you inflict on yourself." She let that land before she went on. "You didn't burn my coop tonight. You put the kerosene down when I told you to. That means you still have a choice in front of you. The question I want you to think about is this. Do you want to spend your life as Sterling's hound or become a man of dignity?" Caleb stared at the table. He had the expression of someone hearing something they'd been avoiding for a long time. Not surprising information, just information they'd been too buried in day-to-day survival to face. His jaw tightened, then loosened. He pressed his thumb along the rim of the coffee cup. "I don't know how to get out from under him," he said quietly. "You don't just walk away from Callahan." "I'm not asking you to walk away tonight," Hannah said. "I'm asking you to decide right now who you are. The rest can be figured out from there." The room was quiet. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. Caleb looked up at her. He looked younger than ever in the lamplight. Just a boy, really. A boy who'd made a series of wrong turns, trying to keep his family's head above water, and ended up somewhere he didn't recognize as his own life. Jesse pushed off the doorframe and came to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "You know anything useful about Sterling's operations?" he asked. "Practical, quiet." "Jesse," Hannah said, "it's a fair question." Caleb looked at Jesse. "Some, not everything. Callahan doesn't trust me with much." Jesse nodded. "All right, that's enough for now." Hannah stood up and took the empty plate to the basin. "There's a blanket in the storeroom. You can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow you figure out what you're going to do." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it again. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" Hannah turned and looked at him steadily. "Because someone has to," she said, "and because being decent to people isn't a strategy, Caleb. It's just what's right." She went to the storeroom for the blanket. Jesse stayed at the table and looked at the boy for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's a long day, either way." Caleb nodded. He looked at the empty plate in front of him, at the clean cut above his eye, at the solid walls of a house that had nothing to do with Callahan or Sterling or debt or any of it. Something in his face shifted. Not resolved, not fixed, but different than it had been an hour ago. That was enough for tonight. 3 days passed without incident. Hannah hauled water from the creek and began the slow process of flushing the well. Caleb was still there. He'd meant to leave by the second morning, but he kept finding another task to finish before he went. Fixed a broken fence board, reshingled a section of the barn roof that had been leaking since spring. He didn't ask for direction. He just saw what needed doing and did it. Jesse watched him without comment for a day and a half. Then he handed him a set of proper tools and stopped watching. On the third evening, a storm came in from the northwest. Hannah smelled it before she saw it, that particular edge in the air. Electric and dry, the smell of rain that was still miles off but moving fast. She'd grown up in this country. She knew what a fast-moving desert storm looked like when it meant business. She spent an hour before dark bringing the horses inside, double-checking the stable shutters, making sure the newly hauled water barrels were covered. By nightfall, the wind was up. By full dark, it was howling. The storm came in hard and mean. The way they did out here, not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming open. Lightning in long sheets across the northern sky. Thunder that rattled the stable walls. The horses were agitated, moving in their stalls, and Hannah was in with them, moving from stall to stall, talking low, keeping them settled. Jesse was on the far side of the barn, checking a shutter that had come loose when he smelled it. Smoke. Not lightning strike smoke, not the slow, confused smell of something accidental, fast and directed and coming from the south wall. He crossed the barn in 6 strides. Hannah. She was already turning. She'd smelled it too. The south wall went up first. Whoever had set it knew what they were doing. They'd used oil-soaked material packed against the base of the wall. And with the wind driving from the northwest, it caught and spread faster than any natural fire would. Within 30 seconds, the lower section of the south wall was fully engaged, flames climbing the dry timber like it was invitation. Hannah yanked the nearest stall door open. "Get the horses out. Go." They moved together, Jesse on one end of the barn, Hannah on the other, opening stalls, driving the animals toward the main doors. The horses didn't want to move toward the fire-lit air, but they wanted to stay in the burning barn less. They came out in a rush, eyes white, hooves clattering on the dirt aisle. Smoke was filling the upper half of the barn fast. Hannah dropped lower, coughing, pushing the last mare out the door. "How many?" Jesse called.
All
6. "Go." She turned back to close the last stall gate, out of reflex, stupid, habitual, and through the smoke she saw movement at the far end of the barn. Not an animal. A person. Callahan had come in through the back. He wasn't alone. Tex was with him, Grady behind. The smoke covered them until they were already inside. Jesse saw them the same second she did. He had no gun on him. He'd set it on the workbench when he was working the shutter. 20 feet away. He moved for it. Tex cut him off. Jesse went a different direction. Callahan was already moving toward Hannah. What happened next was fast and ugly. Jesse fought Tex into the far wall. He was bigger and heavier, but Jesse was faster. And in the close quarters of the smoke-filled barn that mattered, they went into a support beam hard. Jesse got the better of the exchange, but Grady came from behind, and the two of them together drove him down. A burning section of the roof structure cracked and gave way. The support beam beside Jesse buckled as it came down. He threw himself sideways, but not far enough. The beam caught him across the back and shoulder, pinning him to the ground. The wood was on fire. He got his hands under it and pushed, but the angle was wrong, and the weight was wrong, and the smoke was getting thick. Hannah saw it happen and took 3 steps toward him. Callahan grabbed her by the hair. She went backward, and he dragged her rough, fast, not giving her a second to get her feet under her, up the narrow steps to the hayloft. The loft floor was already creaking with heat from below. Half of it was gone. What remained was a broken platform, over a room filling with fire. He dragged her to the railing at the loft's edge, put her back against it. The rail dug into her spine. Below them, the barn floor was a garden of fire, beams burning, smoke boiling up in black columns. Jesse was down there somewhere. She couldn't see him through the smoke. Her Winchester. She'd left it by the loft ladder when she came down to help with the horses. She looked for it. It was gone. She saw it a second later. It had slid through a gap in the cracked floor planking. It was down in the flames below. Uneachable. Callahan pressed his revolver to her forehead. He was breathing hard from the smoke and the exertion, but his hand was steady. He'd done this before, too. That was the worst thing about him. Nothing he did seemed to cost him anything. "This is over," he said. "All of it. You, this property, your drifter friend. Sterling wants it done tonight." The loft shuddered beneath them. A floor plank to her left gave way and disappeared into the fire below. Hannah gripped the railing to keep her footing. Smoke poured up through the gaps, and she squinted against it. Below, she could still see Jesse. He was moving, barely, his face down, shoulders straining, both hands flat against the burning beam above him, trying to push it off, not making progress. The beam was too heavy, and he'd been down too long, and the air near the floor was better, but not by much. Callahan watched her looking at Jessie. He almost smiled. He'll be ashes before the rain hits. She couldn't see Tex or Grady. She didn't know where Caleb was. She didn't know if anyone was coming. The storm outside was screaming, and the fire was screaming louder, and the floor beneath her was giving up board by board. The revolver didn't move from her forehead. Her Winchester was in the flames below. Jessie's hands slipped on the beam. The fire climbed higher, and then the loft went quiet under the roar. That strange, terrible quiet that drops over a moment when everything has narrowed down to one thing, one choice, one next second. Flames ran up Hannah's side of the railing. She didn't look away from Jessie. She held on. The shovel hit Callahan's gunman across the back of the skull, and the man dropped like a sack of wet grain. Caleb stood there with both hands, still gripping the handle, breathing hard, staring at what he'd done. The man, Tex. Tex was face down on the loft planking and not moving. Caleb had come up the ladder from behind with the smoke covering the sound. He'd had maybe 3 seconds of decision, and he'd used them. He looked up. Callahan had turned at the sound, just turned, and that was the half-second Hannah needed. She drove her elbow back into Callahan's gun hand and dropped her weight at the same time, going low, twisting away from the barrel. The revolver went off. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, the flash blinding, and the shot went wide into the loft wall. Hannah didn't stop moving. She came up with the woodworking knife she'd kept in her belt since the night of the first standoff, a short, heavy blade with a bone handle, used for pegging harness leather. She put it into Callahan's thigh to the hilt. He made a sound she'd never heard a man make before, and went backward into the railing. Wood cracked under his weight but held. The revolver hit the floor. Hannah stepped back from him, breathing, knife still in her hand. Below them, the smoke and the fire and the cracking floor, something shifted. A deep structural groan, then a tremendous crash, then silence for one beat. Then Jessie's voice, Hannah. She crossed to the edge and looked down through the smoke. Jessie was standing. He was bleeding from a gash across his left shoulder, and his jacket was burned through on one side, but he was standing upright, and the burning beam was no longer on him. It was in 2 pieces at his feet. He was holding the shotgun he'd gotten to the workbench somehow, and he was pointing it up at Callahan. He'd fired one barrel into the beam's midsection to split it. She understood in an instant. Callahan was still on his feet, barely. His left hand was clamped over the wound in his thigh, and his face had gone the gray-white color of old ash. He looked down at Jessie, looked at the gun. Jessie raised it, not at Callahan's chest, not at his head. He aimed at the revolver, lying on the planking near Callahan's feet, and fired the second barrel. The gun spun off the loft edge and vanished into the fire below. Done, Jessie said. His voice was rough with smoke. You're done, Callahan. Callahan looked at him, looked at the wound in his leg, at the 2 thorn people still standing, and himself barely able to put weight on one side. At Tex unconscious behind him. He was calculating again, same as always. But the numbers had finally run out. Grady had already gone, Hannah realized it. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Grady had cleared out when the beam came down and Jessie got loose. That was the thing about hired men. When the math went wrong, they found somewhere else to be. Callahan took one step, too. He grabbed the loft rail and made it to the ladder and went down it with his bad leg dragging. At the bottom, he moved toward the main doors without looking back, putting all his weight on the right side, leaving a dark trail in the dirt. Hannah watched him go. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. Caleb was standing at the edge of the loft looking down at her. He still had the shovel. He hadn't moved since Tex went down. Is he? Caleb started. Breathing, Jessie said from below. Leave him. Caleb set the shovel down. He looked at his own hands for a moment, then he looked at Hannah. She held his gaze. You made a choice tonight, she said. A real one. Remember it. He nodded. Something in his face was different, wheater than before. There was no more time for it. The loft floor was giving up in sections now. "Come down," Hannah told him now. He came down the ladder fast. Jesse caught him at the bottom and pulled him clear of a falling section of burning rafter. The three of them went out through the main stable doors into the storm. The rain hit them the moment they cleared the doorway. Hard driving rain, exactly what a desert storm delivered. When it finally arrived, not gentle, nothing gradual, just a wall of water coming down. It hit the burning barn like something furious. The fire didn't die immediately, but it bent and screamed and started to lose. Hannah stood in the rain and looked at her stable. It was mostly gone. The south wall had collapsed. The roof was coming down in sections, great burning chunks of timber, hissing as the rain hit them. The stall doors she'd built herself last autumn were ash. The workbench where she and Jesse had practiced with the Winchester was gone. The hayloft where her father used to sleep in the summers before he built the house gone. She stood there and felt all of it, and didn't look away. Jesse came up beside her. He was pressing his palm hard against the gash on his shoulder, his face tight. She could see, by the way, he was holding it, that the wound was serious. Not life-threatening if they dealt with it, but it needed more than a bandage. "How bad?" she asked. "I've had worse." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "It needs proper cleaning. There's shrapnel in it from the beam. Metal fitting." She pulled his hand away and looked at the wound in the firelight and rain. Deep, jagged. She put his hand back over it firmly. "Keep pressure on it." She looked at the yard. The stable was done. The fire hadn't reached the house. It was singed on the near side, but standing. But Callahan would come back. She knew it as clearly as she knew anything. Once the wound was dressed, and Sterling gave the order, Callahan would be back with more men, and this time he wouldn't stop at the stable. "We can't stay here," Jesse said. Reading the same situation. "Red Canyon," she said. "There are caves in the east face. I used to shelter horses there during bad storms when the stable roof leaked. They're deep and they're dry." Jesse nodded. "Can you get us there in the dark?" "Yes." She looked at Caleb. "You're coming with us, I know," he said. They moved fast. Hannah got 3 horses saddled in under 10 minutes. The other 3 she turned loose in the scrubland, far enough from the property that they wouldn't be found and used against her. She packed what she could from the house: medical supplies, food, blankets, her father's registered deed copy in its oilskin wrap. Jesse kept his hand on the shoulder wound and let her work. Caleb loaded water and what food was left without being told. They rode out south in the rain as the remains of Thorn Station burned behind them. Red Canyon was 4 miles south and a world away from Dust Creek. The rock walls rose up in dark red layers, carved by water that had been gone for 1,000 years. And the east face had a series of deep-cut caves that went back far enough to be genuinely sheltered. Hannah had found them at age 12, playing at the edge of her father's territory. She'd never told anyone about them until now. She brought them in single file through the narrow canyon mouth and back into the widest cave, the one that had a natural shelf of rock along one wall and a crack in the ceiling that vented smoke upward when you built a fire in the right spot. She knew every foot of it by feel. They got the horses in and settled. Caleb built a small fire with the dry wood. Stacked in back, there were always dry stacks here, left from previous shelters she'd made over the years, added to each time and replaced. Jesse sat against the stone wall and said nothing, which meant the shoulder was worse than he was letting on. Hannah set her supply kit open in front of him. "Take off the jacket," she said. "Hannah, take off the jacket." "Jesse." He took it off. The wound was ugly. A 3-inch gash along the back of the shoulder, deep enough to show meat, with 2 pieces of twisted metal still embedded in the tissue, remnants of a steel fitting from the beam. It had been bleeding steadily for over an hour. His shirt on that side was soaked through. Caleb looked at it and went slightly pale. Hannah looked at it and went clinical. She washed her hands with water and the last of the carbolic from her kit. She threaded a needle by firelight. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been in years. which she found strange and then stopped questioning. She cleaned the wound first, thoroughly and without apology, even when Jesse's jaw went tight. Then she went after the shrapnel. She used the small forceps from the kit. Jesse didn't make a sound. He fixed his eyes on a point on the stone wall and breathed slow and even, and let her work. She got the first piece in 30 seconds. The second was deeper and angled wrong and took longer. She could feel sweat on her own forehead by the time she had it. She held both pieces up in the firelight. "There," she said. Then she sutured the wound. 7 stitches, tight and clean. Her mother had taught her the stitch on livestock, and she'd practiced it on saddle leather for years after. When she tied off the last knot, she packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it tight over his shoulder and across his chest. Jesse rotated the shoulder experimentally, winced, stopped. "Don't do that," she said. "I wasn't going to do it again." Caleb had fallen asleep against the far wall, sitting upright with his chin on his chest, completely done in. He looked about 15 years old asleep. Hannah watched him for a moment, then looked back at Jesse. He was watching the fire. She moved the supply kit aside and sat down against the wall, not far from him, close enough that she could see his face clearly in the firelight. The shadows did something different to it, in here, made the lines of it more visible. The scar along his jaw she'd noticed before, the way his eyes were still moving, even resting, still scanning the cave entrance. "You should sleep," she said. "I will." She knew he wouldn't, not right away. She understood that, too. The fire crackled. Rain echoed outside the canyon mouth, a faraway sound now, peaceful from in here. The horses shifted and settled. Caleb didn't move. It was, by any measure, a terrible night. They were in a cave, their shelter was ash, and a man with hired guns was probably already planning the next move. But it was also quiet, and they were all 3 alive. That was something. It was enough, for right now, to be something. Hannah closed her eyes and let herself have that for a minute. Then she opened them and started planning. The fever came by morning. "Nothing serious," Jesse said. "Just the body's response to the wound and the smoke and the cold stone floor and a night with no real sleep." Hannah looked at the color in his face and the way he held his arm and formed her own opinion, which was that it was potentially serious and they needed to stay put for at least 2 days, he argued. She didn't argue back. She simply did not move or change her position. And eventually, he stopped talking. Caleb rode out at first light carefully, by back trails, keeping clear of any road where Callahan's men might be, and came back 3 hours later with fresh supplies from old Carter's freight store. Carter hadn't asked questions. He'd handed over what Caleb asked for, and added a tin of salve and a bottle of whiskey, without being paid for either. Caleb reported this, and Hannah made a note of Carter's name in the ledger she kept in her head. She spent most of that first day managing the fever, water, rest, keeping Jesse from deciding he was fine when he wasn't. She changed the dressing twice, watching for infection. The wound stayed clean, which was the main thing. By afternoon, the fever had broken, and Jesse slept properly for the first time real sleep, deep and unguarded, which she could tell because the constant monitoring in his face finally went away, and he just looked like a man sleeping. She sat near the fire and worked through what they had. 3 horses, a registered deed copy. Sterling's pattern of escalation, clearly established. A boy who'd turned a corner. And Jesse, who was a former United States Marshal, living under a false name and apparently thought she didn't know it. She'd figured that out by the second day after the standoff. The way he'd handled Callahan, not the gun. Anyone could hold a gun, but the psychology of it, the specific calculation, the way he'd said "before I get hit," rather than "before. You get me," the instinctive language of a man trained to think about controlled outcomes rather than personal survival. The way he scanned every room, the federal pattern stitching on the inside of his jacket collar, barely visible and clearly picked out. But there, she hadn't said anything. His reasons for traveling quiet were his own, but she thought about it while he slept. On the second night, the fever stayed gone, and Jesse was more himself. He sat up and ate the beans and hardtack Caleb had prepared without complaint, and drank 2 cups of coffee and looked almost normal, except for the careful way he moved his left arm. Caleb had gone to sleep early again. The boy was making up for what looked like months of poor sleep, going out like a light the moment the fire was stable and not moving until dawn. Hannah added wood to the fire and settled back against the cave wall. Jessie was watching the flames. "I know you were a marshal," she said. He looked at her. Not surprised exactly, more like a man who'd been half expecting a door to open and wasn't entirely sorry it finally had. "How long?" he asked. "Since the stable standoff, the way you handled Callahan." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Jesse Morgan," she said. "Is that your real name?" "Yes. Why are you traveling incognito?" He looked back at the fire. A long time passed. Not because he was deciding whether to trust her, she thought he'd already decided that. It was more like he was choosing where to start with something he hadn't put into words for a very long time. "I was stationed out of the Denver office," he said. 7 years. Good years, mostly. I was good at the work. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I had a family, my wife. A boy, Thomas. He was 4. Hannah didn't move. There was a gang I'd been tracking for 2 years. The Rourke outfit. I got closer than they knew, I thought, but they found out. And they—" He stopped, cleared his throat, continued. "They came to the house, while I was out on a circuit ride. My wife hid Thomas under the floorboards. He was too young to understand he had to stay quiet. The fire moved. Hannah held still. They were both gone by the time I got back. The house was burned. Same as last night, near enough," he said it flatly, like a man reciting a record, keeping himself at arm's length from the content. "I got the Rourke gang. Every last one of them. It took 14 months. And then I turned in my badge, because I couldn't make the argument anymore, that doing the job was worth what doing the job cost the people around me." He looked at the fire for a while. "I've been moving since then," he said. 3 years, maybe a little more. It's easier to not put down roots. Easier to not give anyone a reason to be standing next to you when something finds you." Hannah looked at him, at the side of his face in the firelight. "You didn't bring death to the people you loved," she said. "Your retreat from life is what's killing you now." Jesse turned his head and looked at her. "You being here," she said, "working, helping, fighting. That's not what got your family hurt. Jesse, see, you didn't bring the Rourke gang to your door. They came because they were exactly what they were. You can spend the rest of your life making yourself smaller and quieter and more alone, and it won't change what they did. It'll just mean they took more from you than they already have." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. "That's not a simple thing to fix," he said. "I know, you make it sound like a decision. I think it starts as one." He was quiet again. The fire had settled to a deep, even glow, orange and steady, throwing long light across the stone walls. Caleb made a small sound in his sleep and shifted and went still again. Jesse set down his coffee cup. He reached out and touched her face. Just one hand, his right the good side, his palm against her cheek, and he looked at her the way she hadn't seen him look at anything, without any of the monitoring or the calculation, just direct and open and present. She put her hand over his, and then he kissed her. It was quiet, unhurried, the way 2 people kiss when they've both been through enough to know the value of it, not desperate, not performing anything, just real. Just 2 people who'd been standing on opposite sides of the same kind of wound, finding each other in a firelit cave in the middle of the desert. When they stopped, she kept her hand on his. Outside the canyon, the night was clear after the storm. Stars everywhere. The kind of sky you only got out here, after everything settled. Inside the cave, the fire burned steady. Jesse sat back against the stone, and Hannah stayed close, and neither of them said anything else, because sometimes the right thing is to let a moment be what it is without putting words around it. In the morning, there would be Sterling, there would be Callahan, there would be the burned ruin of Thorn Station, and a fight they hadn't finished yet. But right now there was this, and for right now, It was more than enough. They rode back into Dust Creek on a Thursday morning, 3 of them. Hannah in front, Jessie on her right, Caleb a half-length behind. The sun was already high and mean, and the main road was quiet in the particular way it got when people knew something was happening and had decided to be somewhere else first. They'd heard about the auction from Carter, who'd ridden out to the canyon on Wednesday with news and more supplies. Sterling had posted notices on every door from the feed store to the church. Public land auction Friday at noon outside Town Hall. Hannah's property listed by legal description under a notice of abandonment the word Sterling had chosen. Not foreclosure. Abandonment, as if she'd simply walked away, as if she'd perished in the fire, which is exactly what Sterling had told people. Carter had stood at the canyon mouth with his hat in his hands and said it plainly. He's telling folks you didn't make it out of the stable. People believe it because they want to, and because nobody's seen you to say otherwise. Hannah had listened to all of it without speaking. Then she'd said, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Get home safe that night." She and Jessie had planned until the fire burned low. Caleb's part was the most dangerous. He would go in alone the night before, using his knowledge of Sterling's bank layout from 7 months of running errands for Callahan. The ledger they needed, Sterling's real accounts book, the one with the fraudulent land transfers and the manufactured debts, and the names of every man he'd paid or pressured, was kept in the lower left drawer of Sterling's mahogany desk, behind a false panel. Caleb knew this because he'd seen Callahan use it once when Sterling wasn't present. Jessie had looked at Caleb across the fire. "You understand what this means if you're caught." "I understand," Caleb said. "You don't have to." I said, "I understand." Caleb looked back at him steadily. "I've been on the wrong side of this long enough. Let me do something useful." So they'd let him. He'd come back before dawn with the ledger under his jacket, dirty from a back window entry, and slightly cut across the left palm from the latch, but otherwise fine. He set the ledger on the cave floor, and all 3 of them looked at it in the lantern light. It was thorough. Sterling was thorough. 40 pages of handwritten records, names and dates and dollar amounts, properties acquired through debt manipulation, payments to the county sheriff, payments to Callahan listed as consultation fees, and on page 17, in Sterling's own careful script, a notation beside Hannah's property description, Thornhold apply final pressure, Q3. Apply final pressure. Hannah had read it twice. Then she'd closed the ledger and looked at the cave wall for a while. Then she'd said, "All right, let's go to an auction." The crowd outside Town Hall was maybe 60 people. Not the whole town, but enough of it merchants, ranchers, wives, a few children, the old men who sat outside the hardware store most days and watched Dust Creek go by. They were gathered in a rough half-circle around the wooden platform. Sterling used for civic announcements. Sterling himself stood on the platform in a gray, tailored suit, hat in hand, silver watch chain, catching the sun. His lawyer stood beside him, with a ledger of his own, the fabricated one. The bidding had already started. Hannah heard Sterling's voice carrying across the square as they rode in at the far end of the road. He was describing her property in the language of opportunity. Good bones, he was saying. Productive location, unfortunate circumstances. But the frontier moved forward, regardless of individual. He stopped talking. The crowd heard the horses first, then turned, and then the murmur moved through them like water, finding a level, rippling outward from the people closest to the road, confusion becoming recognition, recognition becoming something louder. Hannah Thorne rode to the edge of the crowd and dismounted. She handed her reins to Jessie without looking at him. Walked forward. The crowd parted not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, people stepping back on both sides as she moved through them. She heard her own name said in low voices. She kept walking. She walked to the platform steps and went up them. Sterling had not moved. He was a man who prided himself on composure, and he was working it hard right now. His face had gone careful, and still in the way faces do when the calculation behind them is running fast. His lawyer took a half step back. That was more honest. Hannah turned and faced the crowd. She had the ledger under her left arm. She held it up with both hands so everyone could see it. A murmur went through the square. "This is Gideon Sterling's private accounts ledger," she said. Her voice carried clearly. She'd projected across livery yards in windstorms. This was easier. It details 23 fraudulent property acquisitions in this county over the past 6 years. It lists manufactured debts used to force families off their land. It lists payments made to county officials to ensure those families had nowhere to appeal. She paused. "It has my property in it, listed months before the foreclosure notice arrived at my door." It was a plan. It was always a plan. The crowd was very quiet. "I know why you're silent," Hannah said. She looked at them, not at the platform, not at Sterling, at the people in front of her. "I understand it. You have your own property, your own families, your own debt. You think if you keep your head down and don't make yourself a target, Sterling's cruelty won't reach your doorstep." She let that sit for a moment. "But when you fold your arms and watch him steal from a lone woman, you sign your own names onto his ledger of slaves." Nobody moved. A man near the front, Miller, who ran the grain store, looked at the ledger in her hands. Then he looked at Sterling. Then he looked at the ground. Hannah watched him. She didn't push it. She'd said what needed saying. Behind her, Sterling's voice. "This is theft. That ledger was stolen from private." "By a member of your own organization," Jesse said from the edge of the crowd. He tied the horses and moved forward without Hannah noticing. He stood at the foot of the platform steps, with his arms at his sides and his voice even. "A young man who watched you use him up and decided he'd rather be something else. The ledger is evidence in a federal fraud investigation." He looked at Sterling directly. "The Denver federal office has been notified. I sent a wire yesterday morning." Hannah hadn't known that. She didn't show it. Sterling looked at Jesse for a long moment. His composure had thinned. She could see the edge of something beneath it, not fear exactly, more like the specific anger of a man watching a situation escape his control. "Who are you?" Sterling said. Jesse said nothing. That silence was its own answer. The crowd had been moving through something slow and collective since Hannah got on that platform. She could feel it, not dramatic, not a single moment of decision, but a shift. Like a hillside finally releasing water it had held too long. Miller looked up from the ground. He looked at Sterling. Then he turned and walked away from the auction. A woman near the back followed. Then 2 more men. Then a family, the Hendersons from the North Road Ranch, who'd lost a cousin to a Sterling debt scheme 2 years back and had never said so publicly until now, when leaving the square was enough of a statement. Sterling watched his audience reduce itself. His jaw tightened. His hand went to his jacket lapel, fidgeting with the edge of it. And then he looked past Hannah at the far side of the square. She turned. Callahan was there. 4 men with him, none of them, Tex or Grady, new faces hired on since the fire. All 4 had guns on their belts and the unhurried posture of men waiting for a signal. Callahan's leg was bandaged under his trousers. She could tell by the slight drag in his step as he came forward. His eyes found Hannah on the platform and stayed there. Sterling had a backup plan. He always had a backup plan. Hannah stepped to the edge of the platform and looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at Callahan. Caleb had already moved to the side of the platform, putting himself between the crowd and the new men. His hand was near his belt. The square went still in a different way than before. Not quiet, tense, the air before the rain. Sterling straightened his jacket. "Finish it," he said. Callahan's men spread out across the road. The remaining crowd scattered fast, not panicked, but moving, pulling back to doorways and around corners, the collective instinct of people who'd lived near violence, long enough to recognize what it looked like before it started. In 30 seconds, the main road had gone from 60 people to an open stretch of dust, with 8 armed men on one side, and Hannah and Jesse and Caleb on the other. Sterling stayed on the platform. Hannah noticed that. He always stayed somewhere elevated, somewhere behind other people. Callahan walked forward into the open center of the road. He stopped about 30 feet from Jesse and stood there. The bandaged leg slowed him slightly. Not enough to matter in a draw, and both of them knew it. Callahan had been shooting since he was 12 years old, and he'd done it professionally for 20 years since. Injury or not, he was fast. Jesse walked out to meet him. Hannah watched from the side of the platform. She had no gun on her. She'd come into town with the ledger, not her Winchester, and there hadn't been time to reconsider that. She looked around the square with fast, clear eyes, cataloging. Caleb was behind the water trough to her left. The four new men were positioned across the road, in a loose line, hands near their weapons. And above, on the second-floor balcony of the Dust Creek Hotel, a figure she almost missed. A man with a rifle, barely visible past the balcony railing. She caught the shift of light off the barrel. A sniper, positioned to take Jesse from above, while Callahan held his attention at street level. Hannah moved without thinking. She went back to her horse at the rail. The Winchester was in the saddle scabbard. She'd brought it from the canyon, even without planning to use it today. Habit from the weeks of practice. Reflex. She pulled it out, held it. Her hands were steady. She crossed to the corner of the building with a clear sight line to the hotel balcony. She brought the rifle up, pressed her cheek to the stock, found the figure in her sights. She exhaled. Halfway out, she stopped the breath there. The rifle fired. The man on the balcony dropped backward with a shout. Hit in the arm, the shot going wide of anything fatal, which was exactly what she'd aimed for. His rifle clattered off the balcony railing and fell to the street below. He wasn't dead. He wasn't shooting either. The sound of her shot cracked across the square. Callahan's head jerked toward it for a fraction of a second. An involuntary reflex. He couldn't help it. Jesse drew. The draw was clean and total practice past the point of thought. The gun up and level before Callahan had his eyes back front. Callahan drew fast, genuinely fast, but fast against someone who was already there was not fast enough. Jesse's shot hit Callahan's gun arm at the forearm, clean through. Callahan's revolver hit the dirt. Callahan stood there breathing hard, holding his arm against his side, staring at Jesse. Jesse walked toward him. Steady, no rush. He kept the gun level until he reached Callahan, and then he bent down and picked up Callahan's revolver from the dirt. He unloaded it and put the rounds in his pocket. He straightened and looked at Callahan at close range. "You're going to federal custody," Jesse said. "Not because I want revenge. Because the law says you answer for what you've done. There's a difference, and it matters." Callahan stared at him. His face was gray with pain. Something in his eyes had shifted the cold calculation, finally run all the way out. Nothing behind it now, but a man who'd run his own logic to its end and found there was nothing there. He didn't speak. He just stood. Across the square, the four new men had stopped moving when the sniper went down. They looked at each other, looked at Callahan holding his arm, looked at Caleb, who had stepped out from behind the water trough with a shotgun he'd produced from somewhere Hannah hadn't tracked. One of the four put his hands up. Then a second. The other two looked at each other for one more second. Then they followed. Hired men read a situation. Sterling had found the bottom of his budget. And then, from the far side of the square, where the old hardware store sat on the corner near the sheriff's office, a door opened. Sheriff Dale Pruitt came out. He was a man in his late 50s who had, over the past several years, made a very calculated series of small compromises, each one a little larger than the last, until he'd arrived at the present situation of being wholly owned by a banker in a tailored suit. He'd told himself each compromise was temporary. He'd told himself each one was practical. He'd told himself a great many things. He walked across the square slowly, like a man carrying something heavy. He had his hand on his revolver, but he hadn't drawn it. He stopped in front of Sterling's platform. He looked up at the man who had been paying him for 6 years. He drew his revolver. He pointed it at Sterling. "Gideon Sterling," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the name. You're under arrest." Sterling looked down at him with something close to contempt. "Dale, don't." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Don't say my first name right now. Just step down off that platform." Sterling stepped down. The square was quiet. Then a voice somewhere in the watching doorways said something low that Hannah couldn't make out. Then another voice. Then the crowd that had pulled back started to come forward again, cautiously, the way people return to a place after the danger has passed, not all at once, but steadily. Hannah stood in the middle of the road with the Winchester. At her side, barrel pointed down. Jesse came back across the square to her. He had dust on his jacket, and his left arm was held slightly careful against his side, but his eyes were level and clear. She looked at him. He looked at her. She exhaled. "Nice shot," he said. "I know," she said, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, she almost smiled. They broke ground on the rebuild. 3 days later, Carter came with timber on the first morning, pulled up in his freight wagon before Hannah had finished her first cup of coffee. He didn't make a speech about it. He just said, "Tell me where you want it stacked," and got to work. By midday, there were 9 more people in the yard, the Henderson family from the North Road, 2 brothers named Cole, who ran a small cattle operation east of town, and had never spoken to Hannah directly before that day. Old Mrs. Patton from the church, who showed up with a basket of food and a practical eye for organizing people. She immediately took charge of the meal schedule, and nobody argued with her. By the end of the first week, the south wall was framed and rising. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown every day. He had taken to the rebuild with the focused energy of someone who understood, at least partly, what he owed to the place. He didn't talk about Callahan or Sterling or the 7 months before this. He just worked. Hannah watched him and let him work. She'd spoken to Jesse about what to do with Caleb on the second night in the canyon, before any of it was resolved. Jesse said that he'd look into the debt in Abilene, the original one that had put Caleb in Callahan's reach. Hannah had asked how. Jesse had looked at her with the patient expression of a man who used to be a federal officer and still had some reach he didn't advertise. By the time they were back in Dust Creek, the debt had been cleared. She didn't know exactly how, and she didn't ask. When she offered Caleb the position of head stablemaster, he had stood there for a moment, looking at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. Then he'd cleared his throat and said he didn't have much formal experience. "I know," Hannah said. "You have good instincts and a decent work ethic, and you're honest when you make a mistake. That'll take you further than experience." He'd accepted Sterling's trial was set for federal court in Denver. Callahan went with him, wrist-bandaged, facing charges that ranged from arson to assault to conspiracy in land fraud. The 4 hired men had all made deals with the federal prosecutor. Pruitt had resigned his position, and the county was in the process of appointing a deputy from outside the territory to serve as interim sheriff, which Jesse had arranged before the paperwork was even drawn up. He'd been busy. She noticed that about him during those weeks of rebuilding, the way he quietly handled the things that needed handling at the level she couldn't reach. The federal notifications, the evidentiary chain for the ledger, the proper filing of her deed through the county seat with a federal witness signature to make it ironclad. He did it without announcement, just did it, and moved on to the next thing. One evening, about 3 weeks after the fire, she found him sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the paddock, watching the horses. She sat next to him. "You sent another wire to Denver this week," she said. "Yes. Are they expecting you back?" He looked at the horses for a while. "I haven't answered yet." "What are you waiting for?" He turned and looked at her. "I'm trying to figure out what my answer is." She held his gaze. "What do you want it to be?" The sun was going down behind the ridge, throwing the canyon walls into deep red shadow. The horses moved slowly in the evening light. Caleb was in the new stable. They could hear him, singing something low and off-key to the animals, which he did every evening and which the horses seemed to appreciate. Jesse reached into his jacket pocket. He set a badge on the fence rail between them. The brass was worn smooth, and the pin backing was tarnished. United States Marshal. She looked at it without touching it. I put it away, because I thought the work cost more than it was worth, he said. I was wrong about that. What I was actually doing was making sure the cost came out of me instead of anyone else, which is its own kind of selfishness. She considered that. You're going back to it. I think I was always going back to it. He picked up the badge, held it in his palm. The question was whether I was going to be whole when I did, and he pinned the badge to his vest. He did it carefully, the way you handle something you intend to keep. Then he looked at her. I want to be here, he said. I want both things, and I spent a long time believing that wanting both things was how you lost everything. I don't believe that anymore. Hannah looked at the badge on his vest, then at him. Then stay, she said. Do both. Build something here that's worth coming back to. He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They were married on a Saturday in early October, outside the rebuilt Thorne station in the last warm days before the mountain weather came down. Nobody planned it to be large. It became large anyway. Mrs. Patton organized the food with her usual iron efficiency. Carter built a long table from leftover lumber. The Cole brothers brought fiddles. Caleb stood up front with them as witness. He'd pressed his shirt and combed his hair and looked deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Sheriff Interim Morrison read the words. Hannah and Jesse said theirs simply and directly, the same way they did everything, without performance, without excess, just meaning what they said. Afterward, when the dancing started, and the food was going, and the whole yard was full of noise and light, and people who'd needed a reason to come together, Hannah slipped away from the crowd for a few minutes and walked to the edge of the south paddock. The new stable was solid behind her. The well was clean. The fence line was straight. She looked at what her father had built, and what she'd held on to, and what was growing out of it. Now the plans she and Jesse had drawn up for a schoolroom addition on the north side, the list of families who'd asked about housing their children there during the week, the small library she'd started collecting books for, the reading lessons she'd quietly begun, giving 2 ranch women on Wednesday afternoons, a stage stop, a livery, a school, a place where women and children could come and be safe and learn something. Her father had given her a foundation. She was building the rest herself. Jesse came and stood beside her. He'd left the badge inside. He was just himself in the evening air, shoulder-heeled, eyes clear. They stood together, looking out over the valley. The last light was coming in long and golden from the west, the kind that made even the dry scrubland look rich and full of promise. No regrets, he said. She looked at the valley, at the new stable, at the lights in the yard and the sound of the fiddles carrying out to them on the cool air. Ask me in 20 years, she said. He took her hand again. Below them, Dust Creek sat in the early evening, like a town that had been through something and come out the other side not unchanged, but still standing, which was sometimes the whole of what you could ask for, and sometimes exactly enough. The golden light held, then it softened to rose. Then the first stars came out over the ridge, one by one, the way they always did out here. And the frontier went on. There's a reason stories like this one stay with you long after the last page turns. It's not the gunfights. It's not the fire, or the canyon, or the standoff in the hayloft. Those are just the surface. What sits underneath all of it, what this story is actually about, is something a lot quieter and a lot harder than any of that. Hannah Thorne didn't survive because someone rescued her. She survived because she refused, at every single turn, to make herself smaller than she was. When Sterling sent his notice, she sent it back. When Callahan pinned her against the wall, she reached for the horsebrush. When Jessie dragged a cabinet in front of her door to lock her safely away from the danger, she moved it herself and told him plainly, we stand side by side as equal partners, or we don't stand at all. That's not stubbornness. That's dignity. And dignity, this story argues, is not something anyone can take from you, it's only something you give away. Jesse's lesson is the other side of the same coin. He spent 3 years making himself invisible because he believed that loving people put them in danger. He thought retreat was protection. What Hannah helped him see quietly, without lecture, just by being exactly who she was, is that shrinking your life down to nothing doesn't protect the people you love. It just means the thing that hurt you gets to take more. Grief is real. Survivor's guilt is real. But at some point, staying alive has to mean more than just not dying. It has to mean building something, choosing something, showing up. And then there's Caleb, 18 years old, broke, indebted, working for a man he didn't respect, doing things he knew were wrong because he couldn't see another way out. A lot of people will recognize that feeling, not the frontier setting, but the trap itself. The sense that you're too far in to turn around. What Hannah showed him, with a hot meal and a clean cut, and no performance of forgiveness, is that decency isn't a reward you earn after you've fixed everything. It's the starting point. You decide who you are first. The rest follows from there. That's what this story is really about. 3 people, each carrying damage of a different shape, each learning that the way through isn't around the hard thing, it's straight at it. Hannah with her gun and her grief over her brother. Jesse with his badge and his burned-down house and the 4-year-old boy he couldn't save. Caleb with his empty stomach and his borrowed loyalty to the wrong man. None of them get fixed by the end, but all of them get to choose. And that choice, made deliberately, out loud, at cost, is what changes the shape of everything that comes after. The frontier in this story is a real place, but it's also a metaphor. Every one of us is standing on some version of that cracked, sun-baked ground, holding on to something we built or inherited or fought for, with someone or something trying to tell us it isn't ours. The question Hannah asks, without ever saying it directly, is the same question worth asking in any era, on any street, in any life. Are you going to fold your arms and watch? Or are you going to get up on that platform and say what's true? She chose the platform. Every time. That's the story. That's what it's worth. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is purely coincidental.